Good morning, everyone. So, as you've just heard, my name is Guy Bisson. I'm one of the founders of Ampere Analysis, and my job today is to help you work up an appetite, because I'm going to take you through to lunch with a series of charts and tables and data. So hopefully that's going to make you very, very hungry. What my job also is to run through where we are in terms of the drama business or the drama production and distribution business. What is happening out there in the world and why? Couple of housekeeping slides. If you want a copy of the presentation, please feel free to email me. I will happily send you a copy. My email is on the last slide. Who are we? Who are Ampere Analysis? For those who don't know us, we are London-based. We are specialists in the entertainment industry, and we work with all sorts of clients around the world, from the studios to the channel groups, to the big distribution groups, to the regulators, to the telcos and pay TV providers. We provide data, and hopefully we also provide insight. So, market changes. There's a lot going on out there. I don't need to tell you that. Perhaps the pinnacle or the next phase is direct to consumer from the people who are producing the content. The big studios, the big content owners, for the first time in their 100-year history, cutting out the middleman and going direct. And as I got thinking about trends, and I've come up with, I had to pick 10 trends to run through today, it began to dawn on me that all of those trends were interconnected. And so I thought, if everything is interconnected, everything that is happening out there today, all of those changes, then there must have been a starting point. And that starting point I'm calling the drama God particle. For those of you familiar with particle physics, the Higgs boson or God particle is the thing that gives mass or weight to everything. So there must be one thing that gave weight to all of the changes that we're seeing out there. And as I tracked back through the trends, I realized that that one thing was the need for global rights, the dismantling of the geographic limitation around distribution and licensing. That is the God particle that has kicked off all of the trends that I'm going to talk about, many of the other trends that are happening out there as well. So as streaming platforms went global and needed global rights, they began to move into original production to retain those rights. They gained market share, they gained competitive edge, the incumbents copied that strategy and also went into original production, but it had the impact of reducing margin on distributed and sold content. And so the incumbents and the producers and the big studios decided to go direct themselves, which is self-perpetuating because it then creates an additional access to content or licensing challenge. So we have a vicious circle. But it's also a virtuous circle if you're a producer and also if you're a non-US producer. Because as that competitive edge became of interest, as those local incumbents went into own production, budgets for talent, budgets increased, talent became more scarce, demand for writers became greater, demand for facilities and sound stages, and the cost went up, and that means the risk went up. And that's led to a number of changes, one of which is non-US local production becomes competitively interesting and more cost-effective because it's much cheaper than producing in the US. So interrelated circles have led us to these trends. And the pinnacle of competition today is not technology, it's not how you package or sell content, but it is the content offer itself. And a number of things are impacting strategies around that content offer, and we're going to talk about some of these today. One is regulation, of course, that's specific to Europe. Increased direct competition, we've touched briefly on. Crowded market, we've been there before, but of course it leads to viewer fragmentation. We heard in our first presentation about attention deficit. Evolving demographics, particularly around streaming, the studio and the global licensing challenge, two halves of the same coin, the globalization of services, and slightly separate from that, the internationalization of content. So let's run through the 10 trends that I think we need to be aware of and watching and thinking about when we're thinking about creating, producing, distributing, and selling content. Number one, regulatory. I'm sure you're aware that the European Union is looking to introduce European quotas on streaming services set at 30%. Now, the interesting thing when we did the analysis, and these tables show the percent of content that is currently European in the noted country and platform, and the number of hours they need to add to hit 30%. But what was really interesting was that if you looked on a pan-regional basis, title by title, already 26% of Netflix content is European. And the reason it's different country by country is because not every piece of content is licensed in every country. That global licensing challenge has not been fully conquered. So to meet quota, many of the streamers could actually do that, or get very close at least, simply by changing the terms of their rights agreement and extending the geographic reach of those rights agreements without necessarily buying much more content. It's a very interesting competitive dynamic being driven by regulation, forcing streaming players to actually become more locally competitive than they would otherwise have been. But of course, it's interesting for producers because of the demand for local non-US content. Trend number two, then, is the rise of the new commissioners. And I've been speaking to a lot of producers in the last few weeks for a report I'm working on, and they talk about the old days being 5 years ago, when the main, or indeed often the only commissioner, was the big broadcaster in the given country, the big public broadcaster often. That is not the case anymore. And we're just drilling down here into scripted content, none of the non-scripted, which would boost the totals even more. But look at the size of Netflix. This is forward commissioning. Everything on this chart has not yet been seen, broadcast, or shown anywhere. It is either in production or in development at the moment. Netflix has 254 scripted projects in production or development. That makes it about 2.5 times bigger than, say, a US network group, traditionally one of the major global producers, and 5 times bigger than regional or large pan-regional pay channels like HBO, some of the public broadcasters like ZDF and France Television, and some of the emerging Chinese streaming platforms like Tencent. Quibi, Katzenberg short-form project, is up there already, but when we get down to the new direct platforms, the Disney Pluses and the Apples, they're down there at 7 times less than Netflix at the moment. But the key thing about this chart is that it's not all about the big broadcasters anymore. It's about direct-to-consumer platforms, Chinese streaming platforms, and about studio direct operations and new short-form players like Quibi. So a much more diverse landscape is trend number 2 in terms of commissioning. And, of course, completely new players entering that landscape as well. So while the social platforms like Facebook, Snapchat, and YouTube are largely focused on unscripted, they do a little bit of scripted. And Quibi in particular is looking to scripted commissioning to fuel its platform going forward. So completely new entrants, completely new approach to the market, also diversifying that landscape. Trend number 3, and this is of course interconnected, all interrelated. What happens when demand goes up, when scarcity of talent kicks in, budgets go up and continue to grow. And when we talk about the boom, just to put a number on that, that boom has been 30% growth in global spend on content in the last 5 years. And that is nearly 3 times the rate of the previous 5 years. And the next 5 years, the forecast, we think it will be 30% or close to again. So we are in the middle of not just a boom, but a sustained boom in production spend. And the reason it's sustained is coming back to those cycles that I showed you on that first slide. Those interconnected cycles will continue to fuel that boom in production spend and that demand for content. And trend number 4 is another thing that will ensure that that boom continues to be a boom and not a bubble. And that is holdback and internal demand. Because, of course, as big studios and production groups go direct, they don't want to sell their rights anymore. They're not going out to the international market to sell those rights globally. They're holding them back for themselves. And this chart shows drama production from the top 15 production groups in the world and how much of it they're making for their own entities and how much they're selling out to the global market. And you can see that, of course, Banijay, Endemol, groups like that, 100% of their scripted is going out to the market. But if you're Disney, Warner, CBS, or any of the other big production studios, you're holding back most of that content now. Not just from international sale, but from third-party distributors as well, because you're probably planning, if you're not already doing so, to do something with it in terms of direct-to-consumer distribution. And that, of course, leaves a gap in the market as the studios look inward and retain their content, and also as the budget increases mean risk becomes greater and greater, and they focus in on, in the case of many studios, big franchisable movies and series, then there's a gap in the market for all sorts of other production. And if we think about it, the same few studios have controlled much of the global market for entertainment for pretty much 100 years. As those studios go direct, as they hold back content, that gap needs to be filled. Who is filling it? Telecoms groups like Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom, big production slates now. Pay TV operators like Sky. We have specialist financiers. We have telcos and new platforms, and we have slate financing that is effectively creating mini studios like Blumhouse in the US. And then we have service companies, so the companies that were around the periphery of production, servicing the distribution, or talent agents, for example, in the case of Endeavour. Again, because of that risk profile created by all the changes and dynamics, the increasing budgets, the increasing risk, they are moving into peripheral businesses and doing production financing and production and distribution themselves and beginning to behave like studios, as are some of the major broadcasters like the BBC and ITV in the UK, both of which have rebranded their commercial arms as Studio. So new studios entering the market is our next trend. And that will become even more important as the studios pull back content from the existing platforms. Up to 20% of content on Netflix comes from the major studios who have announced plans to go direct. 20% of their catalogue is at risk of holdback by the major studios. So what are they going to need to do? They're going to need to go out to someone else to fill that hole. And that someone else is going to be the smaller producers and the independent producers. So a big opportunity being created at one level at least of the market. Trend number 6 then is globalization. Remember, back again to that cycle. You need local production to be locally competitive. You can't fuel massive global expansion only on US content, although it goes quite a long way to helping, you need locally relevant local language content. And Netflix realized that some time ago. If we look at their overall forward production slate, again, this is all stuff in the works, not stuff that's on platform at the moment, more than half is now non-US. That is a fundamental shift, a global player, obviously US-based, that is making more than half of its massive production slate outside the USA. And they're doing that for competitive advantage. And we can actually plot, and for cost, because as I said, it's much cheaper as well. And we can plot where they'll probably go next, because we simply have to look at where their most important markets are, and it pretty much correlates with the trajectory of original production commissioning. And while they're heavily involved in Latin American countries, in France, in Germany, in Australia, some of their big markets, where next is going to be Turkey, Middle East, Central Europe, possibly Russian-speaking markets. That's where the production train, the Netflix production train and commissioning train will head next because of that globalization. And of course, globalization means internationalization of content. And that is leading to major language groupings in terms of drama production. Of course, English is the big one, but so is Mandarin. So Chinese production. Do not underestimate the size, the internal market size of China. Between them, the streamers are bigger than any other market in the world, and they are moving into production and into co-production. So Chinese or Mandarin is the second language, and the third, of course, is Spanish. Europe's number 2 language, and important also for the Hispanic population in the US market. So these are the holy trinity of power languages within drama production today. Trend number 7, and again, it's all interrelated, but it's the changing business of distribution. Because if you're a distributor, again, going back to the dark ages of 5 years ago, this was where your business lay. Taking a show, taking it out to a market like MIP or MIPCOM, and flogging it to a channel and maybe a streaming platform, or a telco or a pay TV company who would then take it to the end user. Because of the risk profile, and also because of all that holdback and the changes around rights and the need for global rights, even if you're a distributor who has a parent company as a producer, they're probably holding back content from you. So your business has changed fundamentally. So what do you do? And this is rather a complex slide to say, what do? You move back. You move back in the value chain, and you get involved in production financing, script development, and show development at a much earlier stage. Because if you're paying the piper, you get the rights. And that problem with access to content goes away. So the fundamental business of content distribution has shifted as a result of all of those changes. Also related to risk, also related to those ever-growing budgets and the need to access increasingly scarce talent and the need to make things globally and locally relevant is the necessary evil of co-production. And it's a necessary evil, of course, because it makes things more complex than they might otherwise be, especially if you have lots of partners involved in that co-production. But who is co-producing? Who are the big players in terms of partners for co-production? Well, interestingly, it's back to the major public broadcasters and the streaming platforms. Those are the two big groups of co-producers today. Major public broadcasters, it makes perfect sense. They don't need, at least at the moment, global rights. What they need is a high-quality show for their probably one local market. And Netflix or a streamer, which is the other big group, Chinese streamers and Netflix and Amazon, need the rights for everywhere else. So it's the perfect partnership, and that is where we are seeing most of the co-production activity. Interestingly, US groups, particularly major studios, don't co-produce so much as the European players because, of course, back to that problem, they want to retain global rights. And what is getting co-produced? Well, when I looked at the genres of what was getting co-produced, it was clear there was a standout genre, and that was crime. And I think that is because crime is a universal story, and it travels very well. So it works across borders with multiple geographic partners, for example. The other two categories, the other driver for co-production, is period drama and sci-fi, and that's because they cost a lot of money to make, and you need, of course, then more co-production partners. So the three genres that are driving it, crime, period drama, and sci-fi, are where most of the co-production activity is. Trend number 9, the core audience is changing. Everything we've talked about, I said, was kicked off by the Global Rights Challenge. That Global Rights Challenge was driven by streamers, Netflix and others. And who watched the streamers, at least in the early days? Millennials, young people. And their audience still overwhelmingly skews to younger people. So the majority of Netflix or any streaming customer, they're probably younger than the average. But because that 18 to 35-year-old group is pretty saturated, the growth is actually coming from 40 and 50-year-olds. So the strongest growth segments demographically for Netflix are 40 and 50-year-olds. And that is changing what they want to commission. Because if we look at what 40 and 50-year-olds want to watch, it's different, of course, from what 20 and 30-year-olds want to watch. 20 and 30-year-olds want comedy. They want genre drama like sci-fi and fantasy. 40 and 50-year-olds want crime, period drama, factual documentary. And you can see that in the commissioning strategies of the streaming players. That is another dynamic changing what is getting and will get commissioned and made. So what do Swedes want? Well, if we drill down into one of our data sets, which is a consumer survey we run across the world, and ask people what they think or whether they watch a lot of local content, you can see where Sweden sits on that scale. Swedes seem to love British TV shows. They seem to love international non-US TV shows, but they say they don't watch much Swedish content, films or series. Now, you can probably answer the reason why better than me. It's probably partly a cultural response to the question, the way people respond to things when you ask them what they like. But at least compared to some of the other major European markets, local content seems a little less popular here. And when we look into the two groupings, though, people who love Swedish TV are a very attractive demographic. They're a little older, they're a little wealthier, they're often living in a family unit, and they skew slightly male. Whereas the people who love US shows are poorer, younger, are often living with their parents in that sort of family situation, and skew slightly female. So two different groups driving the market here. And finally, trend number 10, and that is AVOD. So all of the disruption that we've talked about, all of those cycles and what kicked them off, that God particle of global rights, was driven by the subscription model, the disruption of effectively the pay TV market. We are on the verge of the free TV market being similarly disrupted because 2020 will be the year of AVOD. Nominally, AVOD is already crowded. The social networks, of course, are effectively AVOD video platforms. We have a number of pure play AVOD platforms like Tubi and Pluto, although they're primarily US. We have device-focused aggregators like Roku, and we have print publishers through their online presence increasingly moving into video. The space in AVOD that is not yet crowded is what NBC's Peacock called premium AVOD, or hybrid, that is high-quality content owners making that content available for free. And if you watched the Peacock announcement, you'll have seen how their plan is working to disrupt free-to-air television by reducing the ad load on an hour of content in the US to 5 minutes. That's compared to what seems like 55 minutes of ads per hour of content in a typical US network show. So that will roll in the next phase of disruption. That is a major new phase of disruption in the free-to-air TV space. So AVOD in 3 slides. Where are we? Where are we heading? First chart. At the moment, not very high penetration. 5 or 6% of homes in the US using one of the major SVOD platforms on a regular basis. Chart number 2. What are they putting on? What programming and content are they buying? Old stuff. 80% is more than 5 years old. On some platforms, 80% is more than 10 years old. Not very good if you're a viewer, unless you particularly like old repeats, but very good if you're a distributor or content owner who's sitting on an unloved long-tail archive of content, because there's a brand new market coming from all of those AVOD players. But of course that will change, and it will change just as Netflix changed, whereas 5 years ago, 50% of content on Netflix was more than 5 years old. Today, that has dropped to 29%, so a third of content now. Very rapid decline in old content on Netflix. And we'll see the same in AVOD. They will start dropping that old stuff, buying newer stuff, and of course ultimately commissioning their own originals as well. So it will evolve in the same way, but that is the next phase of disruption. And finally, I just wanted I can't say the last 2 minutes because I'm 2 minutes over time already, but give me 1 more minute on this final slide. Tapping the zeitgeist for drama commissions. So what I did was dive into our database of programs that are in development or production. We track nearly 5,000 projects in development and production. We look at what they're about, who the protagonist is, what the story arc is, who's producing, distributing, etc., financing. And I looked into that database and I picked out recently commissioned drama and tried to look for themes, commonalities. Now this is subjective, there are many themes in there of course, and it was my mental processing that picked these 4, but there seem to be clusters around content, and many of them make sense. Me Too and female empowerment, of course, socially topical and an important movement at the moment. So a lot of drama focused around that, and things like gender identity and sexuality. Horror and mystery is actually a strong genre at the moment. It's partly driven by the success of mystery shows on platforms by Netflix, but it's also driven by needing to serve the young demographic on streaming platforms who have a particular interest in that genre. Number 3 was mental health. And again, it's topical at the moment, driven by all of that stuff we're seeing happening on social media and the impact that is having on young people's mental health. That is becoming a very hot topic for newly commissioned drama. And the final one is a bit of an odd one, business or business success. And this is driven almost entirely by China. Because in China, stories about saving the village from poverty through business success or business acumen, or rescuing a business, or finding great wealth through business are hot topics in drama at the moment, and the Chinese streamers are commissioning a lot of that sort of thing. And remember, China is becoming an increasingly important driver for global drama trends. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. I'm going to sit down now with Johanna for a question and answer. Remember, note down my email. I'll happily send you the slides, happily chat to you afterwards. But now we're going to go into a Q&A. So thank you very much.